Hello folks, my name is Mark, this is Why I Hate the World. How you guys doing? So there has been another mass shooting, this time in Jacksonville, Florida. So what happened was there was a video game tournament at a local mall, and one of the guys there had a history of mental illness. He lost, he got upset, he went home, came back with a gun, shot up the place, and killed a couple of people. Thankfully, this time there was a rather small body count. Only 2 people were actually killed, but 10 were injured. I mean, I know that's kind of a shitty thing to say, but in this kind of situation, you really have to look at the best. And it's like, usually these things have a much higher body count, so thankfully this time it was low. I don't know. So what ends up happening whenever we have a mass shooting like this is that people will debate the gun control issue for a little while, and it'll be in the news and it'll be in the national discourse, and then we won't actually do anything about it, and it'll just go away until the next mass shooting. And the reason why that happens is because half of our country, it seems, is in denial that this is even a problem. You know, we have the conservatives and the gun nuts and the Second Amendment people and the survivalists and people who watch Alex Jones and that kind of thing. They think that it's all just some big commie conspiracy to take away our guns so that fucking lizard people or some shit can come and take over the country, who knows, right? And they basically prevent any kind of effective gun control from happening, and then this lets crazy people get their hands on high-powered weapons, and the whole thing happens all over again. So one thing you'll hear from these people all the time is how Chicago is such a shitty place to live. They like to pick on Chicago. And I always kind of wondered, like, why do conservatives and gun nuts in particular always pick on Chicago? And the reason why is there's 3 reasons, really. The first one being that Chicago has been run by Democrats for a very long time. Over the last, 50 years or something, the majority of mayors have been Democratic, small d. Another reason is because black people live there. We really can't understate that. You know, if there were no black people in Chicago, they wouldn't be talking about it. Okay, you can never really, underestimate that racial component when it comes to these things, when it comes to conservative talking points. Number 3 is because there's actually gun control in Chicago. And they like to point it out, especially when it comes to this discussion, they like to point it out as an example of how gun control has failed. Now, there is a lot of violence in Chicago. There's a lot of gun violence in particular in Chicago, but it's not the most dangerous city in the entire country. In fact, it doesn't even have the highest rate of deaths by firearm in the entire country. That's actually Baltimore. As of 2016, Baltimore has the largest number per capita of deaths by firearm. Other cities in the top 10 there include Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, Kansas City, Cincinnati, Cleveland. Chicago is in the top 10 for sure. It's number 3, but it's not the most dangerous, right? Another thing to point out is if you rank states by the largest amount of gun violence, Illinois isn't even in the top 10. Okay, so now these numbers get a little skewed because they're based on per capita. So the smaller your population is, the higher it's going to be. So number 1 is actually Alaska, because they have a very small population. So the amount of gun deaths per capita is very high there. So you can kind of throw that one out. There's not a big problem with people being murdered and such in Alaska, even though they come in at number 1. It's because only something like 500,000 people live in Alaska, 600,000, something like that. Number 2 is Alabama. Right, now keep in mind that this is gun violence, the entire thing. So suicides, homicides. Louisiana, number 3. Mississippi, number 4. Number 5, Oklahoma. Number 6, Montana. Number 7, Missouri. Number 8, New Mexico. Number 9, Arkansas. 10, South Carolina. Illinois isn't even in the top 10. You'll notice all the other shithole Democratic states, right, where the elites live, where the people who eat kale and like leeks and shit live. None of those are in the top 10 either. California, New York, right? They're not, you would expect them to be there. In fact, Texas ranks higher on this list than California does, right? Now, why is that? Is because just the populations in these states are so low that, it skews it. Maybe, right? Could also be because, you know, this is the Deep South and it's the seat of toxic gun culture in the country, right? If you look at all those states, you know, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, that's basically like the deep, deep South. This is where the seat of toxic gun culture is in the country. That's where all the guns are. And it only makes sense that where the guns are is where people get shot by guns. So the truth is that we're actually very, very good at tracking these kinds of things as far as gun violence go. They can track it to specific cities. They can track it to specific neighborhoods within those cities, right? And it's true that basically the pattern goes like this. The higher the number of people who live in that city, the more people are going to die, right? The more people will be murdered, and a higher percentage of those people will be killed by firearms. And that's just due to the fact that these cities, you know, major metropolitan areas in the country, that's where everybody lives, right? So that's where you find problems like this, you know. You could say the same thing about drug abuse. You can say the same thing about homelessness. You can say the same thing about any other kind of social ill you want. There's going to be more of it in a big city and less of it in a smaller city, right? But when it comes to per capita, that's kind of a better measure because it kind of tells you your risk, you know, the risk of you actually being killed by a firearm. And it seems to be that that risk is higher in the Deep South, where the seat of gun culture, I won't even call it toxic, let's just say gun culture in the country. The seat of gun culture in the country seems to be more dangerous, right? Your risk of actually being shot, being assaulted, being murdered is higher than if you live in these other places in the country. And that's just that's what the statistics say. That's what the evidence says. So when you hear people talking about, you know, how Chicago's such a shithole and how Detroit's like a failed state and all this other stuff, you know, just keep that in mind. You know, they're basically saying this for a reason. You know, they have an agenda to push. And yes, it's true, there's lots and lots of problems in Chicago and Detroit. You know, the economy there is shitty, there's gang violence, lots of stuff like that. I'm not trying to belittle that, but what I am trying to say is that it's not as simple as a gun law causing all of these problems. So anyway, that's all I got, folks. Adios.